In the quiet, fancy neighborhood of Torrey Pines Heights, everything seems peaceful, and the lives of the people there look perfect. But hidden underneath is a story of betrayal, murder, and hopelessness, a story that starts with two women looking for comfort and ends in heartbreaking tragedy. This is the story of Claire Mitchell and Emma Lewis. Emma Lewis was 36 when she moved to Torrey Pines Heights, San Diego from Sacramento for Brian's job. Emma Lewis had hoped that the move to San Diego from Sacramento would mark a new chapter in her life. Her husband, Brian, had secured a prestigious position that necessitated the relocation. The promise of a fresh start in the upscale neighborhood of Torrey Pines Heights filled her with a cautious optimism. However, her hopes were quickly dashed. Despite the beautiful surroundings and the seemingly perfect suburban environment, Brian's abusive tendencies persisted. He belittled her at every turn, ensuring that the physical and emotional scars she carried from Sacramento remained fresh. Emma found herself more isolated than ever, trapped in a gilded cage where the walls seemed to close in day by day. Each morning, as she looked out over the pristine streets, she questioned whether her life would ever change or if she was destined to live under Brian's oppressive shadow. Emma had thought that leaving Sacramento might curb Brian's violent outbursts, but the change in scenery did nothing to alter his behavior. In fact, it seemed to worsen. The pressures of his new job only added fuel to his already volatile temper. Every slight inconvenience became Emma's fault in his eyes, and she bore the brunt of his frustrations. The abuse wasn't always physical, his words cut just as deeply, leaving Emma feeling worthless and trapped. The once vibrant woman found herself shrinking into the shadows, her world becoming smaller with each passing day. Brian's grip on her life tightened, and she began to lose hope that she would ever escape his control. The dream of freedom seemed like a distant, unattainable fantasy, and Emma's days became a monotonous cycle of fear and despair. One sunny afternoon, Emma attended a community barbecue hosted in the well-manicured park of Torrey Pines Heights. It was there that she first met Claire Mitchell. Claire was a striking woman with an air of quiet elegance, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Emma recognized immediately. Claire was accompanied by her husband, Greg, a successful businessman whose commanding presence seemed to overshadow her. As the two women struck up a conversation, they quickly discovered a shared understanding of the challenges they faced. Claire's stories of Greg's relentless control and emotional manipulation mirrored Emma's own experiences with Brian. Despite their different circumstances, a bond began to form between them, rooted in mutual empathy and an unspoken understanding of the struggles they both endured behind closed doors. Over the following weeks, Emma and Claire's connection deepened. They began to meet regularly, often under the guise of casual coffee dates. These moments became a sanctuary for both women, a rare opportunity to speak freely without fear of judgment or reprisal. Emma opened up about Brian's explosive temper and the physical abuse she endured, while Claire shared her struggles with Greg's suffocating control over every aspect of her life. They found solace in their shared frustrations and discovered strength in each other's company. For the first time in years, both women felt seen and understood. Their friendship became a lifeline, a source of comfort and hope in an otherwise bleak existence. Together, they began to imagine a future where happiness might still be possible, even if it seemed out of reach for now. Emma and Claire established a routine of meeting each morning on Claire's back porch, a secluded space where they could talk openly without fear of being overheard. With steaming cups of coffee in hand, they shared the intimate details of their lives, bearing wounds that had long been hidden. Emma spoke of Brian's unpredictable rages, the nights she spent trembling with fear, and the bruises she concealed beneath long sleeves. Claire, in turn, recounted Greg's relentless need for control, his strict rules, his constant surveillance, and the way he dismissed her as little more than an accessory to his life. These mornings became a sacred ritual for the two women, a time to unburden themselves and draw strength from one another. In their shared vulnerability, they found a connection that transcended mere friendship. One morning, As the sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, Emma hesitated before sharing a particularly harrowing story about Brian. She recounted a night when his anger had boiled over, leaving her with a bruised arm and a shattered sense of safety. Her voice trembled as she described the terror she felt in those moments, and Claire reached out to hold her hand in silent support. Encouraged by Emma's openness, Claire began to share her own pain. She spoke of Greg's unrelenting criticism, the way he controlled every aspect of her life from her wardrobe to her friendships. While he had never raised a hand against her, his words cut just as deeply, leaving scars that weren't visible but were just as painful. As they shared their stories, the women felt an unbreakable bond forming between them, a bond forged in shared suffering and mutual understanding. One evening, Emma mustered the courage to invite Claire over for drinks while Brian was out of town for work. The invitation felt like a small rebellion against the confines of their oppressive lives. They spent the night on Emma's patio, the warm glow of string lights casting a cozy ambience. As the wine flowed, so did their emotions. They laughed, cried, and shared secrets they had never told another soul. The conversation took a deeply personal turn, and in a moment of vulnerability, Emma leaned in and kissed Claire. The kiss was tender and hesitant, but it held a spark of passion that neither woman had felt in years. That night, they crossed a line that changed their relationship forever, finding solace in each other's arms as they sought refuge from the pain of their daily lives. As the evening progressed, Emma and Claire found themselves sharing deeper and more personal confessions. The barriers they had carefully constructed to protect themselves from judgment began to crumble. Emma spoke of her loneliness and her longing for genuine connection, while Claire admitted to feeling like a prisoner in her own life. The intensity of their emotions hung heavily in the air, and in a moment of unspoken understanding, Emma leaned closer. Their lips met in a tender kiss, hesitant at first, but filled with a longing that had been suppressed for far too long. The kiss broke the dam of restraint, and the two women spent the night together, seeking comfort and solace in one another. For the first time in years, they felt alive, though they knew the consequences of their actions would weigh heavily on their minds. In the quiet moments following their night together, Emma and Claire shared a mix of joy and trepidation. They acknowledged the risk of their relationship being discovered, knowing it could have devastating consequences for both of them. Claire expressed concerns about Greg's controlling nature and the repercussions if he ever found out. Emma, too, feared Brian's violent temper and how he might react. Together, they made a pact to keep their love a closely guarded secret, hidden from the prying eyes of their community and the judgment of their spouses. This clandestine relationship became their refuge, a place where they could be themselves without fear. Yet, they both knew the secrecy would weigh on them, creating a tension that might one day become too great to bear. Despite the challenges and risks, Emma and Claire's relationship grew stronger with each passing day. Their stolen moments together became the highlight of their lives, offering them a reprieve from the darkness that overshadowed their marriages. For the first time in years, they began to dream of a future filled with freedom and happiness. They envisioned a life where they could be together openly, unencumbered by the toxic relationships that held them captive. However, the reality of their circumstances loomed large. Brian's volatile temper and Greg's oppressive control remained ever-present threats, casting a shadow over their hopes. Still, the love they shared gave them strength, and they clung to the belief that someday, somehow, they might escape the prisons of their lives and build a new life together. As their bond deepened, Emma began to entertain the idea of taking drastic action to free themselves from their oppressive marriages. One evening, over a glass of wine on Claire's porch, she hesitantly brought up the notion of killing their husbands. At first, her suggestion seemed more like a dark joke, a way to vent their frustrations. But as Emma outlined her thoughts, the seriousness in her tone became evident. Claire was taken aback, her mind reeling at the audacity of the idea. Though the notion terrified her, a part of her couldn't ignore the allure of a life free from Greg's control. Emma's words planted a seed of possibility, one that would grow in the shadow of their shared despair. Claire's initial reaction was one of shock and disbelief. The thought of murder was unfathomable, no matter how dire her circumstances. However, Greg's increasingly cruel behavior pushed her to reconsider. His demeaning words, relentless control, and utter disregard for her feelings left her feeling suffocated. After one particularly humiliating argument where Greg berated her in front of their daughter, Claire found herself contemplating Emma's suggestion. The idea of eliminating Greg became less about revenge and more about survival. Though she remained conflicted, the possibility of finally breaking free from his grip began to outweigh her moral reservations. After weeks of deliberation and secret conversations, Emma and Claire made a fateful decision. They would act on the same night to rid themselves of Brian and Greg, ensuring their stories aligned and eliminating any suspicions. Emma would sabotage Brian's car brakes, staging a fatal accident, while Claire planned to poison Greg during one of his late-night work sessions. They chose a date, sealing their pact with a mixture of determination and fear. Both women knew the gravity of what they were about to do, but they convinced themselves it was the only way to reclaim their lives. On the chosen night, Claire meticulously prepared the poison, her hands trembling as she mixed the lethal concoction into Greg's coffee. As she carried the mug to his office, her heart pounded in her chest. Standing in the doorway, she hesitated, overwhelmed by guilt and fear. The sight of Greg, engrossed in his work and oblivious to her turmoil, made her pause. Unable to go through with the plan, Claire spilled the coffee down the sink, her resolve crumbling. She knew her decision would have consequences, but she couldn't bring herself to take a life, no matter how much she despised her husband. The next morning, Claire confessed her failure to Emma, expecting understanding but instead receiving a furious response. Emma felt betrayed, her carefully laid plans now in jeopardy. She accused Claire of cowardice, reminding her of everything they had endured to reach this point. The argument escalated, their once unshakable bond now strained under the weight of their divergent paths. Claire tried to explain her moral struggle, but Emma's anger blinded her to any reasoning. The rift between them grew, threatening to unravel their partnership and their carefully constructed facade. While Claire grappled with her hesitation, Emma followed through with her part of the plan. She meticulously tampered with Brian's car brakes, ensuring they would fail during his morning commute. Her actions were calculated and precise, driven by years of pent-up rage and desperation. As she watched Brian drive away the next morning, a twisted sense of relief washed over her. She believed she was finally free, unaware of the chain of events her actions would set in motion. The following morning, Emma's plan unfolded as expected. News of Brian's fatal car accident spread quickly, the result of what authorities initially believed to be a tragic mechanical failure. Emma feigned shock and grief, playing the role of the devastated widow to perfection. Inside, however, she felt a dark satisfaction, convinced that her nightmare was finally over. She contacted Claire, insisting that it was time for her to act as well, unaware that Claire's hesitations had already altered the course of their plan. Greg, ever suspicious and controlling, had noticed subtle changes in Claire's behavior. On the night of her argument with Emma, he overheard fragments of their heated conversation through a phone call Claire forgot to end. The words he caught, Emma's anger, Claire's hesitation, and hints of something darker, sent his mind reeling. Furious and vindicated, Greg confronted Claire, forcing her to admit her affair with Emma. Enraged by her betrayal, he threatened to expose everything, including the suspicious circumstances of Brian's death, leaving Claire terrified of what he might do next. Greg's threats pushed Claire to the brink. He made it clear that he intended to destroy both her and Emma, leaving Claire no choice but to turn to her lover for help. She confided in Emma about Greg's knowledge and his intentions, pleading for a solution. Emma, already on edge from the tension between them, saw Greg as an immediate threat that needed to be eliminated. Their desperate situation reignited their bond, and they agreed to confront Greg together, determined to silence him before he could carry out his threats. Late one evening, Emma and Claire cornered Greg in his home office. Their plan was to intimidate him into keeping quiet, leveraging his ego and paranoia against him. Emma took the lead, her demeanor cold and unyielding, while Claire stood by, visibly shaken. Greg, however, was unmoved by their threats. Instead, he taunted them, mocking their attempts to assert control and revealing that he had already begun gathering evidence to incriminate them. His arrogance only fueled Emma's anger, and the confrontation quickly spiraled out of control. As Greg continued to provoke them, Emma snapped, lunging at him in a fit of rage. Claire, desperate to intervene, became caught in the chaos. In the struggle that followed, a heavy desk lamp was knocked over and used as a weapon. Greg fell, blood pooling beneath him, his lifeless body a grim testament to their escalating desperation. Both women stood frozen in shock, the weight of what they had done pressing down on them like a physical force. Acting on pure adrenaline, Emma and Claire hastily devised a plan to cover up the murder. They ransacked the office, breaking windows and scattering valuables to make it appear as though Greg had been killed during a botched burglary. Every move was calculated, their shared panic driving them to work quickly. By the time they were done, the scene looked convincingly chaotic, but neither woman could shake the feeling that their actions would come back to haunt them. In the days following Greg's death, both women attempted to return to their lives, but the strain of their secret took its toll. Friends and neighbors noticed their uncharacteristic behavior, and Detective Harper, assigned to investigate the case, began to pick up on inconsistencies in their stories. Emma's confidence faltered under scrutiny, while Claire's guilt became increasingly difficult to conceal. The walls began to close in, and the once united pair found themselves unraveling under the weight of their crimes. Detective Harper, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, quickly identified irregularities in the staged crime scene. His questions probed deeper into Emma and Claire's accounts, uncovering subtle contradictions. Harper's intuition told him there was more to the case than a random home invasion, and he methodically gathered evidence, determined to uncover the truth. Harper's investigation took a critical turn when forensic analysis of Brian's car revealed signs of deliberate tampering. Further examination of Emma's movements and phone records placed her at the scene of the sabotage. The connection between Brian's death and Greg's murder became harder to ignore, and Harper began to view the two women as prime suspects in a larger, more sinister plot. As Detective Harper delved into Emma and Claire's digital footprints, he uncovered a series of text messages between the two women. Initially innocent, the messages soon revealed the depth of their affair and hinted at their plans to escape their respective husbands. While the conversations never explicitly mentioned murder, their tone and timing raised red flags, especially in light of the two recent deaths. The discovery placed the women under even closer scrutiny, with Harper convinced that they were hiding far more than they admitted. With the investigation closing in, Emma's composure began to crumble. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that Claire's hesitations and guilt were drawing unwanted attention. In her mind, Claire had jeopardized their plans at every turn. Their once solid bond fractured, replaced by mistrust and resentment. Emma started to view Claire as a liability, someone who might confess under pressure and ruin any chance of escaping justice. Driven by desperation, Emma secretly plotted to eliminate Claire. She rationalized the decision as a necessary step to protect herself from exposure. The woman who had once been her confidant and lover was now a threat. Emma began watching Claire closely, looking for an opportunity to act. However, her growing instability made her careless, and Claire started to notice the subtle shifts in Emma's behavior. One fateful evening, Emma confronted Claire, her intentions clear. The confrontation quickly escalated into a physical struggle. Claire, driven by fear and survival instincts, managed to overpower Emma during the fight. In the heat of the moment, she grabbed a heavy object and struck Emma, killing her. Stunned and shaking, Claire stared at Emma's lifeless body, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. Consumed by guilt and with no other options, Claire called the police and confessed to everything. She portrayed Emma as the mastermind behind the murders of Brian and Greg, emphasizing Emma's manipulative influence over her. Claire claimed she had acted in self-defense when Emma turned on her. Her tearful confession painted a tragic picture of a woman caught in a web of coercion and violence. Detective Harper, though skeptical of Claire's version of events, found enough evidence to corroborate parts of her story. Claire was arrested and charged with her involvement in the murders, her fate now in the hands of the justice system. While she admitted her guilt, she pleaded for leniency, citing the years of abuse and manipulation she had endured. In a detailed confession, Claire recounted her relationship with Emma, the abuse they suffered, and the events leading up to the murders. She described Emma's determination to free them from their husbands and how she had been swept up in the chaos. While Claire took responsibility for her actions, she placed the majority of the blame on Emma, portraying her as the driving force behind their deadly pact. As Detective Harper pieced together the final details of the case, he couldn't help but reflect on the tragic irony. Two women, bound by shared pain and a desire for freedom, had ultimately sealed their own fates through a series of disastrous choices. Their quest for liberation had spiraled into a nightmare, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Harper noted the chilling reminder of how desperation and fear could drive people to unthinkable acts. From her prison cell, Claire replayed the events over and over in her mind. She mourned the lives lost, the love she had shared with Emma, and the choices that had brought her to this point. Her days were filled with regret and self-recrimination, but also a quiet acceptance of her fate. She knew she could never undo the damage she had caused, but she hoped her story might serve as a cautionary tale for others trapped in similar circumstances. Torrey Pines Heights, once a symbol of idyllic suburban life, now bore the scars of its hidden darkness. The quiet streets and pristine homes stood as a stark contrast to the tragedy that had unfolded within them. Neighbors whispered about the events, their sense of security forever shattered. The story of Emma and Claire became a grim reminder that even the most picturesque communities could conceal unimaginable secrets.